master's degree here almost 10 years ago, so it's nice to be back in York and see some old faces and stuff. Yes, we're here to, I guess, celebrate and discuss this new edited collection that we put together. Now, the first thing I want to say about the book is that I think we have the best cover of a Gramsci book ever. So here's some standard covers. So this is further selections from the prison notebooks. This is selections from the political writings. What else do we have? Selections from the cultural writings. So every book on Gramsci has some image of Gramsci, usually a sketch. So we're very fortunate to have this wonderful book cover. And what it is it's a mural of Gramsci in a small Sardinian town. So Gill and Hart, one of the editors, really great work actually, working with an artist, getting this image, kind of a high quality version, and then kind of working it into a book cover. So there's something substantive to be said about the book cover as well, and I think that it kind of speaks to some of the themes of the book, specifically around kind of Gramsci and geography, Gramsci and space. Because one of the key themes of the book is to try to kind of think about the role of space in Gramsci, and to really kind of think about that in a very explicit way. In the past, it's kind of been implicit in a lot of writings. But the other question here is about how Gramsci travels, and that's to borrow the title from Adam Gordon's chapter. So there's an image on the back, or a picture of Gramsci leaving Sardinia to go to Turin for university. So that image really kind of captures a sense of how Gramsci traveled himself, and he did travel to the Soviet Union and other places as well. So one of the things we kind of take up in the book is how Gramsci's scholarship and Gramsci's politics have traveled globally. So that's one of the key themes. I also want to kind of spend a few minutes talking about the history of the project. Started in 2009, Alex Loftus, a friend and colleague of mine, had a bit of money through the British Academy to have a workshop, and Alex generously flew many of us in to spend a weekend discussing Gramsci. We all submitted papers ahead of time. And it was a really kind of pivotal moment. It was the first time a bunch of geographers, principally geographers, but not exclusively geographers, got together to kind of think about some of these issues around kind of space and Gramsci. From there, and kind of coming out of the actual workshop, Alex, Stefan, Gill, and I then began to kind of conceive of what an edited collection might look like. So we spent some time thinking about how it could be expanded, how it could be kind of rounded out from that kind of initial workshop. And we sought out a variety of different contributors, including Nicola, who wrote a really fabulous paper for the collection, thinking about difference and uneven development. So we're really fortunate that everyone else kind of came on board. I should also mention that the book wouldn't be what it is without the contributors that did a ton of work, actually really thoughtfully, intentionally crafting their chapters and really taking seriously the revision process that came out of kind of some kind of long and really generative and really rich editorial meetings that we had. The last thing I want to kind of speak to is the question of nature in Gramsci as just kind of one of the key themes in the book, or the question of political ecology. That is the relationship between nature and society, and the ways in which kind of environmental politics might be understood through a Gramsci lens. So I think that this book is the first real sustained effort to think about the question of nature within Gramsci's writing. And we're really fortunate to include a chapter by Benedetto Fontana that's a revised version of an article he published in '96 called The Concept of Nature in Gramsci. There's also a really wonderful piece by John Berger that I think sets the scene of the book, literally, physically, and geographically as well. So Berger's contribution is to say that Gramsci's experience of the Sardinian landscape matters immensely for his political outlook, his political sensibility. So Berger kind of looks through the history of colonization and invasion and settlement within Sardinia to make that claim. But I think the real contribution of the book is to look at the different ways in which nature figures in Gramsci's writings, but also to think about the question of nature and hegemony as well, and the way in which many kind of hegemonic struggles, progressive or conservative, now necessarily revolve around the question of nature. broadly conceived in one way or another. And so there's a really nice chapter by Abdurazak Karim that looks at the question of nature and the MST's mobilization. So that's a nice kind of very forward-looking chapter. But I think the more kind of substantive point is that I think what Gramsci has on offer and what authors try to kind of get at here is a much richer and more integral understanding of historical materialism than what is offered in debates in political ecology that have really filtered through the likes of kind of David Harvey, Noel Castry, and the late Neil Smith. So the argument here is a much broader sense of culture or ideology is always entangled with political, economic processes. In the name of time, I'm going to leave it at that. Turn it over to Nikki shortly.
It was a real privilege to be invited to be part of this project, and Mike is very generous. We've had our disagreements, in fact, about how to read Gramsci on gender, but I love that kind of productive aspect of this project. So I was asked to say a few words about how the renaissance of historical materialist readings of Gramsci, political dimensions of that, the question of difference and uneven development in 5 minutes. So we'll confront what to do with the remainder of my time at the end, but briefly. The book proposal established our task as one that included how to illustrating how a Gramscian analysis answers the turn, in geography in particular, but in the social sciences, towards an explicit engagement with the nature of the political, with the response that the political resides in concrete struggles to produce different histories. And along with that, the project sought to recover the conceptual resources for theorizing difference within the Marxian philosophy of praxis that Gramsci articulates. So my contribution to the volume was very literal in this sense. I went back to rereading Gramsci's texts on the Southern question and the sexual question directly after much of the secondary literature has considered race and gender through, I think, elaborate appropriations of other dimensions of Gramsci's work. And I can't really do justice to the argument or the issues at stake here, but I thought I would just try to flag a few observations for potential discussion, because I'm very eager to hear what our commentators also have to say about the volume. But essentially, on the question of the Southern question, Gramsci's essay, and the politics of racialized uneven development in Italy, I tried to bring attention to how Gramsci's analysis really involves the mutually constitutive nature of the material and the ideational, including how apparently political failures to organize the marginalized South were in fact underwritten by failures to properly analyze and understand the material articulation between North and South. And indeed, the observation of Gramsci's critique of Orientalism, avant la lettre, in the Southernist literature that was ostensibly coming from progressive quarters. And I note that this reading of his essay on the Southern question applies, I think, equally to the subsection of the essay on Notes on Italian History, on the history of the subaltern classes. So in other words, that essay on the subaltern classes need not be divested of its material political economic dimension. And in that sense, I concur with Himani Banerjee and others who illustrate how that tradition of reading Gramsci has eliminated the political economic dimensions. On the question, the Southern question, in Gramsci's discussion of Fordism, he unpacks the Fordist model's explicit emphasis on monogamous heteronormative family structures, anticipating, I think, later feminist work on social reproduction under Fordism, and illustrates how the class-differentiated nature of the Puritan ethos of that model, which was deployed in reorganizing family and worker attitudes, including consumption patterns in which women were particularly visible. That these two forms of analyzing race and gender, within those, Gramsci identifies the construction of social hierarchies articulated to the material and to the spatial and class-differentiated uneven development of capitalism, while appreciating the affective consequences by valorizing autonomous political subjectivity of marginalized groups in all of his calls for an emancipatory project. So I think Gramsci's analysis provides a very thick theorization of difference and uneven development in the Marxian tradition, and his work underscores that anti-racist and feminist struggles must remain self-reflexive or self-reflexively engaged in a materialist analysis and in a historical context. And indeed need to be able to do that in order to understand how their ethico-political claims can be co-opted by less progressive forces. So I anticipated running out of time. I didn't write much of a conclusion to that, but this is how I think this volume has been very useful in getting us to contribute to this recovery of Gramsci as a historical materialist thinker with sensitivity to these very pressing issues of space, difference, and development issues. So I'll turn it over to Stefan.
Thanks to you all for coming. And I'll actually start with a series of additional thanks as well to some people in the room and others. Thanks to Alex, Loftus, who's not here in London, and Mike for actually dragging me and partly Gill back into Gramsci, so which I wasn't necessarily anticipating at that moment, but I'm very happy to have gone through that process. Thanks to Shannon and Chris who've agreed to take care of the filming, which is going to be at some point online, I think, with Antipode. Also thanks to the people who have organized and sponsored this event, above all the York Bookstore, which has done the bulk of the organizing, and also thanks to the editors of Antipode, our editors at Wiley, the Department of Political Science, and the Faculty of Environmental Studies for sponsoring today's event. Let me say just a few things about the relationship between space and politics, sort of to connect with some of the things that Nikki was just saying. It is well known, not the least to the works of Robert Cox and Stephen Gill and Esteban Moreira, who happens to be here, who taught me about these things first, more than 20 years ago, it so happens. As well as from other people, that Gramsci's Marxism is steeped in a particularly nuanced understanding of history and historical method. Now, a major of intention of this book is not to detract from Gramsci's historical sensibilities, but it is to insist that Gramsci's method is also profoundly geographical. Looking at how Gramsci develops concepts always through an analysis of particular historical moments and specific spatial relations, be those across city and countryside, between regions, between the national and the international, may convince us to describe Gramsci's philosophy of praxis as nothing less than a form of spatial historicism. Now, emphasizing Gramsci's historically nuanced geography has major implications for what has become to be known as radical geography, a constellation of work that has helped immensely to develop Marxist and other radical forms of analysis since the 1970s. On the Marxist side, as Mike has just alluded to a minute ago, radical geography has been driven above all by the hugely important but also distinctly non-Gramscian approach of David Harvey and his many influential students, including the late Neil Smith. We suggest with this book that Gramsci deserves a much more central place in radical geography, and indeed in geographically inflected approaches to social theory and political ecology, more generally speaking. One of the most important reasons why Gramsci should move to the central stage of geographical historical materialism is the still unsurpassed importance of his historically and spatially nuanced approach to political analysis and strategic thinking. As we now know, better than ever, thanks to recent or recently translated debates on Gramsci's linguistics, we can say that for Gramsci, politics is above all a practice of translation, a practice of transforming social interests from their real existing, often narrow and particularist, that is to say, economic corporate form, into a potentially universal, indeed hegemonic, that is, revolutionary state. Gramsci insisted that politics understood as translation is a profoundly historical and deeply geographical practice. It entails intellectual and organizational capacities to link social and political forces and bring strategic concepts across multiple spatial divides, those between city and countryside, the Italian north and south, revolutionary Russia, and Western Europe. To put it differently, as we do in the conclusion, a project for communist hegemony cannot be declared in the abstract, as has sometimes been the case in recent political theory. It can only be developed in and through concrete historical and geographical situations. Now, in our book, various authors may make very original use of Gramsci to highlight the importance of thinking political strategy and analysis, both historically and spatially. I will just mention a few examples to whet your appetite. Working with Gramscian Scottish socialist Hamish Henderson, David Featherstone, in his chapter, gives us various tools to think about global solidarity as a translocal and transnational spatial practice. Abdurrazak Karim describes how the path of the Brazilian landless movement, MST, to a politically ecological conception of social transformation was produced through a veritable geography of mobilization and alliance building that has managed to reach across various spatial scales in Brazil since the late 1970s. Vinay Gidwani and Dinesh Podel insist that a proper understanding of the coming to power of Nepalese Maoism requires a historically deep and spatially situated ethnography, a micro-historical analysis of peasant consciousness in a village context. And finally, Gill Hart, our co-editor, underlines in her chapter that to take populisms seriously today requires that one deploy Gramsci's political linguistics to shed light on the historical and geographical transmutations of nationalism, to properly critique Jacob Zuma's appeal and that of Youth League President Julius Malema. She urges us to unearth the ways in which their populisms re-articulate and redirect memories of anti-apartheid struggle in an eminently dangerous and indeed fascist direction. So I'll end it with this, and I'd also like to thank Greg, Albo, and Shubhra Gururani and David McNally for agreeing to say a few hopefully critical words about aspects of the work and perhaps stimulate even some discussion after we're finished.
Thanks, Stefan, and Michael and Nikki. I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book over the last few weeks. I've read it in Cuba, so it was a very interesting place to read and think about current dilemmas of hegemony in politics and take a distance from kind of the day-to-day battles over the crisis that are still going on here. I think the book does a fair bit to push in new directions in Gramsci's studies in ways I hadn't thought about or thought as thoroughly through as the text does in terms of both space, region, nature, things, grappling with those through an excavation of Gramsci's thought along angles I had not thought of. And I think it reveals some different ways to think about what has been more standard ways I've thought about Gramsci as most political scientists in terms of questions of power, political regime types, the integral state, and so on. And I think what it did is actually force also a pushing, from the angle taken on, forces of pushing beyond some of the ways or dichotomies that we've framed a lot of Gramscian thinking in political science over Western versus Eastern roads to socialism, the question of revolutionary versus Euro-communist paths. although what often is meant by that has been the particular trajectory of the European communist parties as they move towards social democracy. Also, the way that we think about identities as either self-contained identities articulated to a project of hegemony or more fluid conceptions of discourse. I think when when these essays go through Gramsci, thinking along a series of different lines and putting an emphasis on the historicism and in the conception of both nature and ourselves, they lend a different inflection to thinking about all those things, which I found particularly helpful in the essays, obviously closest to my own interest, from Nikki, Jim Glassman, Stefan's essay, and Alex Loftus's. There was something about reading this book which was also kind of different from reading the text, which has something to do with the longer-term trajectory of myself at York. When I first came to York, I had Stefan in my first class at York on the first day of teaching at York. As an undergraduate, little did I know that my best undergraduate student would also become one of my best graduate students and a colleague sharing this project from then, which he actually started tweaking my interest as such a capable undergraduate student, telling me how I take urban issues and spatial issues, etc., and its inflection to politics seriously. This began, for a group of us, a long-term political project, intellectual project at York that goes back, I guess, on to 20-odd years now, in relationship to political ecology, which had linkages between a few of us in political science, some in geography, and a wider group in the Faculty of Environmental Studies, which of course was what led us to create the International Political Economy and Ecology School almost 20-odd years ago, which was explicitly constructed around these themes of the historical nature, the historicization of nature, and the role of politics in the creation of nature and the reciprocal relationship in turn. And also what, for I guess almost a decade, Stefan and I and others were involved in a reading group as part of an editorial component of Capitalism, Nature, Socialism. We read about a decade on this material, which was also linked to actually a lot of political projects we were engaged in, which date back also to the 90s in terms of the Green Work Alliance, the Metro Network for Social Justice, the creation of the Toronto Environmental Alliance, and we continue on today with some of the work that we commonly do in around the struggle for free public transit and also climate justice. So those are kind of themes that were resonate across the book, which also kind of resonated with a lot of intellectual thinking and practical political thinking that we have undertaken over the last couple of decades. There is some themes in this book which I think are particularly resonant for the political conjuncture we're in as well, that speak to some particular aspects of the difficulty we're having in confronting the crisis and pushing beyond it. And some of them have to do, I think, with a couple of themes. I would like to just read a few quotes that are captured by some of the authors. One of the themes across the book is, of course, is the emphasis on Gramsci's conception of the integral state, dealing with the interrelationship or interpenetration of political society and civil society, and dealing with nature, of course, as it becomes a key linkage in the articulation between these two across the essays, but it also is a way that many of the essays grapple with thinking about a new politics. In the essay, which was I found particularly interesting, by Jeff Mann on money and the space of civil society, he makes the following point. In short, in dealing with the integral state, it is an explicit recognition that, on the one hand, seizing control of the government technically understood alone will never be enough, but on the other hand, at this historical conjuncture, neither is a path that avoids the state qua political society adequate to revolutionary realization of regulated society. The bourgeois integral state's resilience is attributable to the fact that civil society and the state together constitute an internally differentiated, dialectically unified state form that contains socially and territorially the possibility of possessing all the intellectual and moral forces needed to organize a complete and perfect society. That is, of course, Gramsci's riff at the end on Hegel and Hegel's interpretation of that. This, I think, quote should be juxtaposed against another point that was made by Alex Loftus in his essay dealing with the construction of nature, or the production of nature, taking off from Neil Smith's famous notion from his book Uneven Development, which was obviously very pivotal to all the work we did in Capitalism, Nature, Socialism. A lot of that debate was developed around that. And Alex makes a linkage to particularly some of the immediate political issues we face today in dealing with environmental questions. He writes, all too often, environmental justice groups have either been co-opted by technocratic, non-governmental organizations, or the fires of radical environmental groups have simply been extinguished. The philosophy of praxis, in contrast, is pregnant with possibilities for developing radical environmental insights. In this regard, Gramsci maintains it is untenable to cling to a conceptual separation of nature and society, and of thought and action. Rather, nature and society are moments within a differentiated unity. Here we discover the conditions from which radical ecological worldviews might emerge, which then is particularly the theme that Stefan and Gillian end on, which I think is a marvelous essay in thinking about the present problems of developing a counter-politics anchored in theoretically in aspects of critical geographical materialism, but also in a new socialist politics. Stefan and Gillian there argue against simply the declarative politics that have become common around the idea of communism from Badiou, Sijak, and others. And they argue instead for insistence of the politics of translation and hegemony, that is the struggle for an integral state and in political and civil society. I think when they do this, there's an important aspect which is really relevant to the politics that we have today. I think Stefan and Gillian then push beyond some of the focus of the conceptualization of hegemony that we've gotten from Perry Anderson and Peter Thomas, particularly which has framed this question over the task of forming a united front. And they argue that the present conjuncture is quite different and pushes us beyond that debate. The classical problem being, of course, is the united front comes from a united vanguard party organizing an alliance of vanguard parties into a united front and other social forces into a united front, which has simply today typically been reversed in the sense of an organizational alliance of a united front on the hope of generating a new political force. And what they argue, in a sense, is that these are all limited. And I think they make a couple of very good points. That this requires a much deeper understanding of what is involved in the construction of political alliances today. And they particularly emphasize the spatial patterning of differences, by which they mean to also denaturalize them and therefore problematize them in a systematic way. Also that the understanding of hegemony as a spatial project in which scale and place play a prominent role in configuring our politics. That is, how do we build political alliances across scale and privileged struggle, not any particular scale, is the theme that they raise. And I think the other point they raise following Lefebvre is the need in today's political conjuncture to find ways to carry forward into our political struggles and anti-productivism to deal with the commodification of capitalism, the endless drive for accumulation, and deal with wider environmental issues. I think the book, and to some extent the final essay, still leaves us with a couple of dilemmas that are the dilemmas I think that we ourselves have struggled with here over the last couple of decades in trying to think about these issues. And that is, it's still a question of how we're going to build and form a post-Leninist, non-social democratic, red-green political formation. That's a mouthful, but that is our dilemma. And it's a bit of a difficulty of the text that nobody quite grapples with that question, and we don't have a matrix of It's an argument for that kind of political formation, but there's not an actual grappling with the difficulties in the political sociology that we've had in forming that type of political movement. The other thing is, of course, is that we're in a conjuncture which is demanding, not for the future, but in the immediate sense, a social, ecological, economic agenda, some program and strategy for intervening in this conjuncture. And the way that we would find through a transitional program a way to link different movements in and around a project of hegemony. That is what we're grappling with. And it is striking that many of the themes that are important for a socialist alternative that would also be important for, say, climate justice, work time reduction, alternative responsible production, alternative labor process, etc., have been dropped to the side out of the ecology movement. So this kind of the project of building a new political formation and building and constructing the program that will push us forward still remains an open question. And I think this is exactly what the book why I like this book so much and why I put that exactly on the agenda. Thanks.
I think you've taken my 5 minutes a little too seriously, perhaps. But before I begin, I would like to thank Stefan for inviting me to this forum, and I'm really glad that the book launch is actually happening, and delighted to be part of this discussion, dialogue, and thinking through, against, with Gramsci. Initially, I thought that I'll only focus on one section of the book, but as I began reading it, I actually found myself reading a lot of it, partly because it is a very well put together collection, which brings together an excellent collection, which very carefully and critically reads the writings of Gramsci and makes a bold, as Greg points out, bold contribution to an already robust body of work on Gramsci. Given that there is so much renewed interest and so many volumes have come, I think this collection stands out for pushing Gramsci in directions which may not have been taken otherwise. Especially in the context of global capitalism and neoliberal hegemony, which marks a contemporary moment, engaging with Gramsci's political philosophy and exploring how he can be translated and made available to reconfigure the terrains of a struggle seems not only critical, but also politically necessary. And this is precisely, I would say, what the volume does. Acknowledging that Gramsci was not a general theorist, but his work, as Stuart Hall said, was of a sophisticated kind. Essays in this collection rigorously, but also gently, enhance this work of sophistication and often offer nuanced intervention. In arguing for reading Gramsci spatially, and I think this is quite critical, and considering his historicism as fundamentally geographical, the contributors accept the challenge of dislocating and decontextualizing Gramsci from its Italian context, and while attentive to the philological reading of his work, they also adopt a much richer, thicker, generative, and I would say non-dogmatic approach to Gramscian philosophy. In this sense, they do not offer a hagiographic reading, but garner conceptual and political resources that Gramsci might provide to think about possible political interventions in the contemporary. It is in this laudable spirit, the volume offers not just an exposition on Gramsci, but pushes and stresses Gramsci in different directions and spaces to see how Gramscian insights might bear in new situations and queer, gendered, and post-colonial settings. Equally importantly, by engaging with the questions of difference, at least to some essays, which like many of his, the question of difference, which like many of his other ideas is not clearly enunciated, the contributors make an effort to not only offer a corrective to the relative silence of this question, but some contributors engage actively with post-colonial critique through the writings of our own Himani Banerjee, Fanon, and Lefebvre, and draw attention to Gramsci's use of the category social group. Not simply as a substitute for class, but a grouping of people that came together politically, opening up possibilities to engage with the question of race, and to some extent gender sexuality, particularly in the work of Nikki and Mike's paper. In stretching Gramsci further, it may well be productive to push these lines of inquiry even further and to see how different regimes of difference and inequality are produced and stabilized in different historical and special settings, and perhaps push Gramsci further out of the box of political scientists. In the few minutes I have, as someone who has engaged with political ecology for a long time, I've taken upon myself the task to comment on the section on nature. As you all know, there is no clear exploration or enunciation of nature in Gramsci's writing. It does not figure prominently, and if it does, in a few places, it is not unambiguous, resulting so far in any lack of systematic engagement with nature in Gramsci until recently. And it may well be futile to seek such an explicit theory of nature in Gramsci. But what is productive, as many of the contributors acknowledge, is to locate the question of the question of nature in Gramsci's philosophy of praxis itself. For him, the world is earthly matter that is produced out of human action, as he asks, and I quote, "If human history should be conceived also as a history of nature, how can the dialectic be separated from nature?" Unquote. Given that his method, Gramsci's method, is fundamentally relational, with a focus on constitution and construction, underlined by his insistence on understanding the social, political, material, and historical relations in interconnected ways, it may well be argued, as the contributors do, that it is an ecological conception of the world in which nature is constituted of the multiple terrains of power. With his attention to political transformation in which the individuals transform themselves, as well as the social relations they are embedded in, thereby modifying external relations both with nature and with other men. For Gramsci, production of nature is always entangled in the consolidation of hegemony. The real philosopher is and cannot be, for Gramsci, other than the politician, the active man who modifies the environment, which is an ensemble of social, natural, material, and epistemological relations, which each of us enter to take part in. With such a molecular and metabolic sense of humanity and materiality, Gramsci may well be considered to be the first political ecologist enrolling and attending to the non-human integral way to issues which others are just coming on to discover more recently. As many contemporary environmentalisms of the global north, to which Greg refers to, increasingly turn towards populism and consensus to generate stable and hegemonic notions of environmentalism, and crises, it is thus imperative that we work to dislodge an easy and monolithic reading of nature and make explicit the deeply entangled and sedimented relations of capitalism, modernity, and ecology in diverse settings, which some of the papers attempt. Here I cannot mention, but mention that the absolutely brilliant and lyrical piece by John Berger, and I do agree that not only is the cover beautiful, the Berger piece, which is actually a letter from John Berger to Subcomandante Marcos called How to Live with Stones, and I hadn't read it before, and I think it's really is a deeply material and metaphorical rendering of Gramsci, his physical and his historical setting in which Gramsci's ideas took shape. And here, I want to quote him to say how he makes us think about the question of nature in a far more dynamic way. And I quote in this piece, Berger's piece, "Everywhere a stone is touching a stone, and here, over this pitiless ground, one approaches something delicate. There is a way placing one stone on another, which irrefutably announces a human act, as distinct from a natural hazard." Unquote. It is in tracing this ecological and relational dynamic of an unstable balance, Berger succinctly highlights the entangled and embedded relations of force that simultaneously make social and natural worlds. And it is precisely this ecological and material understanding of nature, resources, and land that describes not only Gramsci as a person, as a scholar and activist, but also as also his philosophy of praxis. And I think here the work, particularly of critical ecologists in this volume of Karim and Gill, Judy Whitehead and Vinay Gidwani, brings out this kind of relationality and materiality in their work, and also bring the Southern question much more, thinking about whether Gramsci can travel and can he be translated. But in want of time, I just want to say that having always found myself, and willingly so, to be interacting in the company of geographers, often the sole anthropologist. So it is in that observation that there is some kind of a marginalization of my own standing that I'm bringing out, and I will urge you to bear that. Precisely by anthropologists have attended to, and I think you refer to the work of Donald Moore, who have attended to the question of Gramsci and have thought about questions, particularly in political ecology, much more seriously. My only sense is that while the authors have taken the message of space seriously and rightly attended to the spatialized historicism that marks Gramsci's philosophy and method, barring a few exceptions, I could identify only a hesitant engagement with the concept of culture. It would be safe to say that one of Gramsci's fundamental legacy is its insistence on the primacy of culture in the elaboration of power, and thus of the power of culture in the historical social bloc, as Stuart Hall, Paul Willis, William Roseberry, and Gavin Smith have shown. As some contributors point to the culturally embedded practices of memory, of family and kin, and to the everyday as the space of rupture and transformation, as in the case of Nepal's Maoist movement, as central to articulation of a political struggle that challenged the ruling class hegemony, we may want to, and I pose this a question, want to attempt a more sustained engagement with the cultural meanings and materiality of everyday life that will further stretch the work of the Sardinian and to pave the way for further engagement, possibly open up possibilities of translation and pose a more robust political critique. Thank you.
Well, I have the great advantage and disadvantage of coming last on a speaker's panel of 6, which means that virtually every major point has already been covered by one of the commentators and makes, in some ways, my remarks redundant. But on the other hand, it means that because I've covered everything, I can pretty much go wherever I want and not feel that I've neglected some really crucial part of what is an incredibly rich book, and I think you get some sense of that simply by the presentations. We have been offered here one of the most original and stimulating contributions, frankly, not just to Gramsci studies, although I think this volume does represent that, but in many ways to a critical, stimulating, provocative thinking about the problem of left anti-capitalist politics that take space, nature, and politics seriously. And for that, all the contributors and the editors are to be congratulated. Because they've covered so much, I will start at the end. I'm in the last speaker, so I'll start with the final essay, although I'll try to relate it to some of what came earlier, but then all of you in the room who are into dialectics will know that every ending is in fact a beginning in any case, and in many respects I think that's true of this volume, which is to say that it is the beginning of a whole series of further discussions, debates, and conversations that are going to be needed. But the last theme is politics, and the last essay by Stefan and Gillian Hart really poses some of the questions of what it would mean to think about a left politics today that was genuinely revolutionary and anti-capitalist, informed by all of the discussions which have come up until that point. And so I'll say a little bit about that, because I think they rightly take both an affirmative and a critical stance in relationship to what has become probably the most important recent contribution to Gramsci studies, which is to say Peter Thomas's book, The Gramscian Moment. And they take, I think, both an affirmative and a negative stance. Affirmative, insofar as in that book and in subsequent work, Peter Thomas has argued, I think, quite persuasively, indeed powerfully, for an alternative to what we might call the new ontological strand in left politics. The idea that we need to step out of the realm of the everyday and to pose communism and revolutionary change as something almost transcendent, as something almost metaphysical in relationship to the actual existing state of affairs. Now, given the actual existing state of affairs often around us, it's easy to see that impulse. It's easy to understand why not being able to identify transformative energies and possibilities in the everyday, there is a temptation for those of a more philosophical bent to take refuge elsewhere in some kind of transcendental politics. But I think quite rightly, the contributors to this volume challenge that. But at the same time, they also raise a fundamental theoretical and political challenge that basically eludes Peter Thomas, for instance, in his book, which is to say, to theorize, thematize, and problematize difference in relationship to left politics. And by making that a central problematic, not something that gets touched on in passing here and there, I think they foreground a key problem that confronts all of us, but they do so in a way that directs us to Gramsci as a source of a new, invigorated engagement with questions of difference. So I'm thinking, obviously, both of Nikki and Michael's essays, which probe sexuality and the Southern question, but also the really creative and compelling ways in which Stefan and Gillian push Gramsci into a kind of interlocution with both Frantz Fanon and Himani Banerjee, with respect particularly to race and anti-colonial struggles. And I think all of those essays, in doing so, chart a path beyond the paradigm or the framework of intersectionality. And they begin to think about the mutually constituting forms of social domination, power, and oppression that are characteristic of any actually existing capitalism at any both temporal and spatial set of coordinates. And this interrogation of difference, as I say, I think is extremely rich, but it poses for all of us the problem of what would it mean to think about a project of counter-hegemonic, radical, anti-capitalist politics that was able to retain the necessary elements of difference and actually pose the problem of, as to use Marx's phrase in the Grundrisse, the unity of the diverse. And I think here I would want to put some pressure on some of the hesitations that I think a number of the contributors, and Stefan and Gillian, portray with respect to what I'll call the problematic of the United Front. And this is posed in the concluding essay. But I think the issue for us is really this: whether foregrounding all of the issues, questions, challenges, and problems of differentiated social locations and relations to the dominant logics of power and exploitation, it is possible to return to the problem, and I say the problem of the United Front, not in terms of the instrumentalities through which Gramsci imagined it. He was thinking in an era of mass working class parties, for instance. We don't live in such a context. But the problematic is that of trying to think through, theoretically and politically, the ways in which differentiated social rebellions and resistances might still be developed in such a direction that they might actually pose a hegemonic project. Without that, it seems to me there's no left politics. Without that, we are simply left with the celebration of resistance without being able to pose the problem of social transformation. And here I think there is a crucial concept in Gramsci that he develops in his thinking about the United Front, which I think in many ways took it outside of, or at least began to extend it beyond, the way in which it had been formulated originally in the Communist International, and that is Gramsci's reflections on the democratic philosopher. And the democratic philosopher, in terms of an attempt to think about how one generates what we might call a subaltern, hegemonic or counter-hegemonic worldview, one which is rooted in the actual everyday lives and struggles of oppressed and exploited people, but is also more than the sum of its parts. And I don't want to pretend for a moment that I have the answer to that. But I think that it is in some ways the problem that these really fine essays keep pointing us back to. They are in some ways saying to us that there are certain conceptions of left politics which are frankly obsolete. That after these reflections on space and difference in particular, we cannot in good conscience return to certain notions of a unified class subject which in fact was premised on the obliteration of differences and on their repression. So what would it mean, in other words, to talk about a unified revolutionary collectivity in which the differences were alive and thriving, but constitutive of something higher, something liberatory, and something transformative? And in that spirit, I will finish with what I think is really a very, very provocative quotation from the final essay, where Stefan and Gillian entertain the idea that this could involve an understanding of hegemony as a modality of convergence among a plurality of self-organized political forces. In this latter understanding, socio-political forces undergo mutual transformation in convergent points of struggle or processes of organizational condensation, yet they are not assimilated into a hierarchy of primary and secondary antagonism. That seems to me in some ways to be very much the project that confronts every single one of us who still thinks in terms of anti-capitalist transformation of society. But what I find most stimulating and challenging and important about this volume is that it compels us to think about this in richer and more powerful ways. And in that regard, I think all of the contributors are to be congratulated, the editors thanked, because this is a book, I think, to which we will return in many different kinds of discussions and debates for quite some time to come.
Thank you, and that's Celia Braves, who is our brilliant, brilliant editor. I think as to kind of do justice, you can stand up, Celia, please. Celia is there. Anyways, but I do think that the task of editing and even furthermore the task of creating an index for a book on Gramsci, an edited book on Gramsci, poses huge challenges with all the different volumes, different terms and everything else. And she did a marvelous job of really actually binding and tying the book together for us. So thank you, Celia. That's very much. We're all here for questions. I'll see if there's questions before I have anything to say. But yeah, questions that would be great and appreciate it. And thank you so much for all the comments.